The story of Darwin and his finches has become one of the greatest legends of the sciences, on par with the tale of Newton and his apple. However, as with most legends, the real story is both more complex and more intriguing. Darwin's finches are all of the same family and cover 5 genera with 17 species. In the genus Camarhynchus, one finds the tree finch, along with the woodpecker finch and the mangrove finch. The woodpecker finch can be seen using a cactus spine to pry insects from a branch. In the genus Geospiza, one finds the ground finches, the cactus finch, and the vampire finch. Here, the vampire finch can be seen drinking the blood of a Nazca. In the genus Certhidea, one finds the warbler finches. In the genus Pinaroxia, you have the cocos finch, the only member of Darwin's finches not native to the Galapagos. And finally, in the genus Platyspiza, you have the vegetarian finch, seen feeding on a flower. All of these finches are most closely related to each other and all descended from one common ancestor. So how do you go from this to this? The answer, of course, is natural selection. More precisely, Darwin's finches were created by adaptive radiation. Whenever two populations are competing for resources, natural selection will push the two populations apart in a process known as divergent selection. A great example of this are the small, medium, and large ground finches, which feed on small, medium, and large seeds respectively. A small finch that tries to eat medium seeds will be outcompeted by the medium finch and will return to small seeds. And so the 3 species are kept intact. Resource partitioning can occur on scales small as single trees, where different birds will occupy different areas of the tree depending on their niche. In this way, they can reduce competition and all gain an advantage. Over time, this separation leads to speciation, and you end up with many species of finch, each with its own special diet. This is what we know now, but in Darwin's time, this was all a mystery. To understand how we got here, we must go all the way back to England in 1831. Charles Darwin had been offered the opportunity to be the naturalist on a ship sailing the coast of South America. He would also provide company and companionship to the ship's captain, Robert Fitzroy. The mission of the Beagle would be to survey the coast of South America while making observations on the geology and biology they observed along the way. As the ship's naturalist, Darwin was responsible for collecting specimens as well as fossils, and making observations in his journals about the species he encountered. On the 16th of September in 1835, after sailing around Cape Horn and stopping along the western coast of South America, the Beagle arrived in the Galapagos Islands, where Darwin would make some of his most famous discoveries. Darwin filled pages and pages of his journals with his observations of the wildlife on the different Galapagos Islands. He remarks, "In my walk I met 2 large tortoises, each of which must have weighed at least 200 pounds. Darwin notes that he is able to knock a bird off its branch with the end of his rifle, because the species of the Galapagos are so new to the predation by humans. Darwin also happens to notice a family of finches. He writes, "A group of finches are the most singular of any in the archipelago. They all agree in many points, namely in a peculiar structure of their bill." Darwin immediately picks up on the strange nature of the birds' beaks, but is not able to give an explanation for this peculiarity. A debate is often portrayed between Darwin and Fitzroy, disagreeing greatly on the nature of these finch species. Fitzroy is said to have considered each bird to be perfectly designed for its role in life, with a bill to match its diet. He writes, "All the small birds that live on these lava-covered islands have short beaks, very thick at the base, like that of a bullfinch. This appears to be one of those admirable provisions of the infinite wisdom by which each created thing is adapted to the place for which it is intended." Darwin, of course, is suspected to have put forth some pre-evolutionary theory about how perhaps each finch was merely a variety, adapted to a new ecosystem. In reality, Darwin was much more unsure about what to make of the finches. Darwin was puzzled by the finches, so he did not give them much thought until nearly 9 months after he left the archipelago. The Beagle was not the theater of evolutionary debate that some historians paint it to be, but rather 2 men collecting specimens and noting that there was some peculiarity in the groups of finches that should be looked into by real ornithologists. In the end, Darwin ended up classifying the finches as 6 species in 2 separate families, after incorrectly identifying the warbler finch as a true warbler and missing 5 species altogether. Darwin does make a statement that probes the possible mutability of species, but it is in regard to a group of mockingbirds on the islands, not his famous finches. He writes, "A scanty stock of animals tenanted by these birds, but slightly differing in structure and filling the same place in nature, I must suspect they are only varieties." He notes that if 3 separate species of mockingbird found on the islands could be shown to be varieties, this would undermine the stability of species. Evidently, Darwin was beginning to convert to an evolutionist, but it was a different bird altogether that had prompted his thinking. Once back in England, Darwin spent a great deal of time unpacking his specimens and adding to his various notebooks. He took his bird specimens to John Gould, an experienced ornithologist. Gould confirmed that the mockingbirds were indeed members of the same species. He also correctly identified that the beaks of the Galapagos finches were deceptively variant, and that all species were members of the same family, and perhaps the same genus. In July of 1837, Darwin opens his first notebook on transmutation, and famously writes that he had been greatly struck from about a month of previous March on character of South American fossils and species on Galapagos archipelago. These facts origin, especially the latter, of all my views. After Darwin had accepted an evolutionary perspective, he realized that the enigma of the finches could be explained if they, like the mockingbirds, came from separate islands. Darwin unfortunately had failed to label where he collected his finch species. He began to write to Captain Fitzroy and his other shipmates, asking for their own collections from the islands. He gathered the collections of his servant, Sims Covington, which contained 4 finch species. Darwin then began to try to reconstruct the localities of his own finch species. However, this process involved a lot of guesswork and estimation. A number of originally unlabeled Darwin specimens appear to have acquired island localities later in a completely circular fashion, based upon the published information provided in Darwin's Zoology of the Voyage of the HMS Beagle. Due to confusion about island names, mixing up the order of visits, the relabeling of specimens, and generally the lack of attention Darwin paid to the finches, he was ultimately unable to properly reconstruct the finch localities. It was bold of Darwin to attempt this reconstruction at all, seeing as how he could have easily overlooked any number of finch species while in the Galapagos. Nevertheless, Darwin had accepted evolutionary theory and was fairly confident that transmutation could explain his finch species. However, contrary to legend, Darwin's finches do not appear to have inspired his earliest theoretical views on evolution, even after he finally became an evolutionist in 1837. Rather, it was his evolutionary views that allowed him to retrospectively understand the complex case of the finches. Finally, while writing what would become The Origin of Species, Darwin realized the selection advantage that diversified individuals would have, meaning that the 2 extremes of any population would tend to survive. He writes, "The more diversified the descendants from any one species become in structure, constitution, and habits, by so much they will be better enabled to seize on the many and widely diversified places in the polity of nature, and so be able to increase in numbers." Finally, he had his explanation for the various forms of finches and their adaptive radiation, but it had taken him nearly 2 decades to come to this conclusion. The legend of Darwin's finches puts forth 2 incorrect assumptions. Firstly, that the finch and other Galapagos species convinced Darwin of the mutability of species while in the Galapagos. Actually, Darwin paid little attention to the finch species, and it was only after seeing Gould's analysis of them and adopting an evolutionary framework that they became interesting to him. Secondly, the legend frames the finches as a jumping-off point for Darwin, from which he constructed the rest of his theory. In fact, Darwin understood the adaptive radiation of the finches only retrospectively, and without an accurate record of their localities, he could not definitively say that his explanation was the correct one. The finches do not even make it into the final version of The Origin, although the Galapagos is mentioned several times. So the question remains, if Darwin didn't bring special attention to the finches, why are they so famous? In the post-Origin era, Darwin's praise of the Galapagos as a haven of biological diversity had marked it for study by biologists. Ornithologists referred to the Galapagos as classic ground in the history of biology only 17 years after the publication of The Origin. Indeed, the Galapagos becomes a hotspot for ornithological research in the late 19th century. With this spectacular growth in the number of collected specimens, there eventually became a similar impressive advance in the biological understanding of Darwin's finches. It was this close study that sparked debates among evolutionary biologists of the time. Percy Lowe insisted that finches were comprised of hybrid swarms of just a few originally unhybridized species, while Erwin Stresemann defended the theory that geographic isolation had led to speciation. It was the research of David Lack in the 1940s that would put an end to these debates, and also finally turned Darwin's finches into a rigorous demonstration of speciation through geographic isolation. Lack showed that the percent of endemic or native species on any island was proportional to the distance of that island from the center of the archipelago, proving that geographic location and isolation was key in the creation of new species. Lack quoted Darwin heavily in his book and used many of Darwin's original ideas to explain the finch species. This helped readers synonymize Darwin's findings with the new research and theories of neo-Darwinism that had risen in the 20th century. Lack also popularized the term Darwin's finches to refer to the finch species of the Galapagos, as well as the Cocos finch. This nomenclature undoubtedly cemented in people's minds the association between the birds and Darwin's theory. Finally, Lack perpetuated in his book that Darwin had separated the finches by island while still in the Galapagos, suggesting that Darwin had inklings of their evolutionary significance while still on the Beagle, a claim that we have seen is unfounded. In the years since the publication of Darwin's Finches, the tremendous success of Lack's book has helped to make these birds famous, far out of proportion of their actual role in furthering evolutionary theory. So where has all this debate and controversy led us today? In our understanding of these finch species and their complex biological past. To understand this, we must consult the two leading researchers on Darwin's finches. For the past 30 years, Peter and Rosemary Grant have spent 6 months of each year capturing, tagging, and taking blood samples of the finches on a small island called Daphne Major. Let's see what they found. Evolutionary biologists spend a lot of time theorizing what evolution in progress would look like. They define evolution as a shift in allele frequency, some observable change in the genetic makeup of a population. What this would look like would be a shift in the distribution of a certain trait being selected for. Biologists have come up with formulas to predict how far a population will shift given the strength of selection. However, they were never able to test their theories, and as Haldane says, no scientific theory is worth anything unless it enables us to predict something that is actually going on. Given a certain trait selection coefficient, a certain selection event was predicted to move the distribution of a trait, in this case bill size, by a fraction of the standard deviation. After a drought in 1977, the Grants returned to Daphne to find that the average bill size had shifted. Plants producing smaller seeds had died, so a slightly larger beak was now favored. The Grants used this shift in distribution to calculate the strength of selection on the finch beaks. Knowing the strength of natural selection allowed them to estimate the rate of evolution, demonstrating that indeed Darwin's finches could have arisen by adaptive radiation. This was groundbreaking in evolutionary biology, as it provided concrete evidence of evolution in progress. This research was only possible because the Grants had been extremely detailed in their measurements of the finch population, leading up to the drought, and they picked this finch species because they saw it as iconic in evolutionary biology. The Grants were interested in the finches because they associated them with evolution, and because of their close attention, they were able to observe evolution. Ultimately, it was Darwin's mild interest in these strange birds that sparked over a century of close study and research. It is likely that had it not been for Darwin's mention of the finches, or David Lack's use of the term Darwin's finches, the Grants may have found a different bird species to study. But because of the legend of Darwin's finches, we were able to observe what Darwin would have thought impossible: evolution in progress.